This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, with my governor, Ron DeSantis, laying out a plan to kind of reopen the state in stages and many other states doing something similar, there seems to be light at the end of this tunnel, doesn't there? But of course, even though COVID-19 will be with us for months to come, that leaves us contemplating what America looks like after the coronavirus, after the lockdowns.
Oh, man. Well, it's an interesting thing to see. And of course, in a sense, it's a big experiment. The gradual openings up don't look the same across the United States, which in one sense makes sense given the different infection rates and the different kinds of demographics and the different kinds of social densities. But you also have very different ideas about this, and we're seeing this kind of governor by governor. It was a fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal written by a guy that I actually know, a state senator from the state of Illinois, arguing that governors have had unchecked power in this kind of whole thing, and the legislators haven't actually been able to speak to that, and that's actually a violation of the sort of balance of powers. And of course, he's talking in Illinois, and that is one of those states where there's been some very, very interesting policies, not to mention places like Michigan. And these places aren't just different, than other states. Within those states, you have Chicago and everywhere else in Illinois. Within Michigan, you have Detroit and everywhere else in Michigan. And these are very, very difficult decisions. I mean, the governor of Michigan, tells people they can't go visit their second homes, which is literally, half of Michigan that has a place up by, they all say up north, right? Where there's
in
no
the Upper Peninsula, right? Yeah. You got to do the oven mitt, and then it's up here at the top side. I forget how to do the oven mitt.
Well, it's not just the Upper Peninsula. I mean, seriously, it's anything north of you. It could be 3 miles, and it's still we're going up north to the lake house sort of thing. It's right. Michigan's a great culture. So, but and you had Governor Newsom in California. Good heavens, basically as it was almost as if as a punishment. We're going to close all the beaches again, this weekend. And even city by city now you have mayors saying, no, you're not. You can't do that. And, this is going to be a stumbling way forward. And, of course, the other wild card, Shane, is no one really knows what the market forces are going to do on this. In other words, Disney World can reopen in your state. What does it look like to stand 6 feet apart in a line for Space Mountain, Yeah,
who knows, John? With this sort of thing happening, I often think that there were states between the two coasts that, in essence, already had social distancing, right? Their way of life was much more distant than the coastal cities. And so I wonder about the wisdom of a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, and I think that's been the source of a lot of frustration as we reach hopefully the end of this thing. I also think that we're looking now at a news cycle that's going to shift to what happens after the lockdown ends. And of course, the thing that immediately came to mind when you and I were talking just before the program were the accusations against Joe Biden and the presidential campaign that's just now heating up. And,
right. There's a presidential campaign. Did anybody remember that?
Yeah. By this time, in every year that I can remember, every election year that is, it was nonstop, wall-to-wall, total coverage of the presidential campaign in the beginning of the year. Now, I've heard virtually nothing about it except for these allegations. And we've been hearing about the allegations against Joe Biden going back to about 1993 for a while now. But we have more specifics this week, and that's sort of going to change the picture a little bit. And Joe Biden has also openly denied them. So he's, for the first time, broken his silence, addressed them. What do you think that's going to look like? I mean,
that's what happened Friday morning, and it did take over the news cycle. And again, there's been very little that has been able to take over the news cycle in terms of, these sorts of elections. And the appearances that former Vice President Biden has made during these lockdown times have been, a mixed bag of I'm not sure he's all there, and he seems a little disoriented, and he certainly hasn't been able to draw the crowds and so on. But on the flip side, President Trump hasn't been able to do his rallies, and that's the big source of so much of his support. And we saw in the early days of his daily press briefing something of his approval rating going up and then going kind of back down again with a series of missteps by him and some of his people as well, or just things that were easily seized upon by the media. Of course, we talk about things like approval numbers, and the polls were so wrong in 2016, it's a very interesting thing. I'm not sure anyone's going to know going into November really where we're at. I don't think the poll processes that we actually have in place, that people actually use, organizations actually use, really get to the heart of where people are, particularly in flyover country, particularly, a whole generation of people who no longer have things called phones, that are plugged into their wall, or they don't have a home phone anymore. I mean, there's just a lot of problems with the polling process. So you put all that together and, what's the answer? I don't know. But these allegations are a big story, and they're a big story for a number of reasons. Number one is we've had now for years a culture-wide reckoning.
With sexual harassment.
With sexual harassment, assault, sexual abuse, with bad actors in the past. And not even bad actors, although specifically we need to point them out, but a culture in which sexuality was promoted, and this was kind of in the high wave of the sexual revolution. And women were, actively encouraged to behave a particular way. And it went way beyond any sort of morality or comfort level. It gave men a get out of jail free card for a really long time. It was a confusion of the whole thing that we were saying. Add that to men's sin nature and their propensity towards lust and power, and you have a big mess. And that mess now is being exposed. We have, as Ed Stetzer used to say, the light is shining and the cockroaches are scurrying. And when you have something like this, there's going to be true accusations mixed with false accusations. The fall doesn't just affect men. We clearly see that it does. It also affects women. And there are women who I think were victimized, felt obligated to go along with it. And that's what's so hard. Now we have it happening on both sides of the aisle.
Well, that's what you see with the allegations emerging now, is that something has changed in the culture. Something has enabled women to come forward for the first time and be,
and that's a good
sort of
thing.
taken
and
seriously.
That's a very, very important
yes.
thing, because that wasn't actually a part of the experience of, for a long time.
No, exactly. And now, John, what's emerging, I think, is the double standard. I pointed this out on social media yesterday and, ticked a lot of people off. But when we hear allegations from the other side of the aisle, we're very, very prone to believe them. We just immediately want to take them seriously. When we hear them from our side of the aisle, we're much less prone to believe them. And it seems like both sides of the aisle are really guilty of not being willing to apply the same standard of proof, right? When we're dealing with a Republican Supreme Court nominee, we have a very different set of reactions from the left than we do when we're dealing with a Democratic presidential contender. And the same thing, I think, goes for many of those on the right who want to take this very seriously.
It's a version of what we called in our same-sex marriage book the drunk uncle problem, right? It's like if someone's to the left of you, they're evil. If someone's to the right of you, well, they're just part of the family. But it's a little bit different than that, too, because it also has to do with believability. And this has to get to the heart or take us back to the heart of the Christian worldview, Shane. The only way forward in this is not for us to sit in armchairs and say, here's exactly what happened in that, Senate hallway where Tara Reade is accusing the former vice president of, and it wasn't just harassment, her accusations crossed the line into assault. Yeah. And what we need to go back to is this clear framework of the fall that, the bad guys aren't just those on the other side of the aisle. And the good guys aren't just those on our side of the aisle. We're all affected on the fall. And listen, I've said this before. I'm going to say it again. I imagine I'm going to say it 7 more times between now and the election. The guy we all need to read right now is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who himself was not a flawless individual, but one of the great Russian writers of the last generation. And he has this remarkable line, and it is just this clarifying point that the line of good and evil does not pass between, nations or people groups. It does not pass between political parties. He didn't say that, but I'll add it. It runs right down the middle of the human heart. And if we don't all think that the capacity for sin and for violating the dignity of other people, and by the way, and this is what's really hard to say, because one of the things that's tripping those on the left up right now is the way that they talked during the Kavanaugh hearings was every woman should be believed in her accusations.
Right.
I absolutely,
just on the basis of accusation.
Just on the basis of accusations.
Any proof or substantiation.
Right. And listen, there are reasons that every woman should be taken seriously in their accusations. Number 1 is because we live in a fallen world. Number 2, because men can be scum. And number 3, because we know we were in a culture like that just yesterday, right? So the accusation should absolutely be taken seriously. But the line of good and evil doesn't draw between men and women either, right? Where men are the bad actors and women will never use these things to alleviate guilt or to get past their power. Now, I'm not saying this happened in any of these cases. I'm not saying this happened in the Kavanaugh situation and, with the President Trump's accusers or with Vice President Biden's accusers. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying
Clarence Thomas. We do reach a point now where that's very tough, where we cannot know with certainty what happened, 20, 30, 40 years ago in these instances. We have to, apply a standard of proof, and then if the accusations fail to meet the standard of proof, then we have to, assume innocence. That's kind of what our justice system is based on.
Yeah, well, and look, I think all of this has something to do as well with how we approach politics right now. I think there are time periods in history where you can kind of live off of the great individual thesis. In other words, where you're in the sort of culture that produces great men and great women, and those great men and great women can be followed. This is, by the way, back to Solzhenitsyn, only this time in A World Apart, his speech at Harvard University, in which he said that a sign of a decaying culture is a lack of great statesmen. So you enter into cultural moments where cultures aren't producing great men and great women in the same sort of sense. And so how you engage those leaders, how you follow those leaders, how you take those leaders seriously, how you live according to your principles, just can't be measured in any sort of blind obedience. Not that there should ever be blind obedience, because, the greatest leader in the Old Testament was King David, and obviously he wasn't all that, great. He had more than one Me Too moment. But at the same time, there's a cultural awareness that I think has to go along with, as we sit answering that question, what time is it? Where do we live in cultural and redemptive history? And we're just not in a point right now where blind obedience or blind trust in what the media says and what political leaders say, how people handle accusations. I mean, you kind of watch this thing with Biden unfold and you kind of think, yep, there it is. Okay, here's his first appearance. It got loud enough that he actually had to respond to it, which he did Friday morning. And he's going to do an equivocal, denial. And, the cynic in me says, let's see, next week, what we'll be talking about is his, equivocated denial, right? He'll go from an unequivocated denial to an equivocated denial, and then it'll go on and on. But that's a cynic in me, because we've seen this unfold so many different times.
It's a very familiar pattern, right? I couldn't agree more, John, especially about the line of good and evil running between, through the hearts of every individual, not by parties, not by nation, not by sex even. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after this. We've got a lot more stories we want to get to on Breakpoint this week.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back here on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, there are 3 stories this week about trends that have been ongoing in our culture for some time, and how the coronavirus and the lockdown in particular are going to affect these trends moving forward. And I'm thinking of the decline of marriage, the decline of small churches and the financial plight that they've sort of found themselves in, and then the opioid crisis, because we've got stories on each front about the likelihood that the lockdown will actually worsen all 3 of these crises. The first one that we talked a great deal about this week at Breakpoint was the decline of marriage. There's a Wall Street Journal article earlier this week detailing new stats from before the lockdown that show that marriage has reached the lowest rate in the United States since 1867, which is when the records first began. So the stats are that about every 1,000 people, according to a new report by the National Center for Health Statistics, only about 6.5 new unions will form annually. And if you know the historical statistics, especially when you get back to my grandparents, your grandparents' ages, you're looking at a massive drop here. It's truly historic.
Oh, yeah. No, it is. It is one of those things that maybe falls into the category of what calls what and how far back do you go. And, you can eventually get all the way back to a place called the Garden of Eden. But this is clearly stuff that the coronavirus is exacerbating, not causing. And it's a very important thing. History is rarely a cause and effect thing. It's usually a catalyst plus about 7 causes that is just waiting for kind of the right trigger to set it all off. And I think you've got a number of social demographic things. Look, we've been talking about the declining marriage rate for a long time. I mean, I speak, every summer to high school and college students, and they know it. I say, hey, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is fewer people are getting divorced. And the bad news is, and they all say in unison, fewer people are getting married. This has been a problem for a really long time. It has to do with delayed marriage, what we call extended adolescence as well, not crossing kind of the thresholds of adulthood traditionally understood. It has to do with a great bit of cynicism around marriage and family and the cultural myths. I often talk about this, if you talk about things, for example, as kind of tangible and interesting as sexual satisfaction, you watch movies and television shows and it's pretty clear the least sexually satisfied people on the planet are married people.
The ones who are married.
Yeah, right. But if you go to the stats, and the stats are fascinating, it's not only married people, it's longtime married women. That's actually, they're the winners. I'm telling you, this is what the numbers say. It's a fascinating thing, but the deeper point here is all the other things that flow from this, because there are fundamental unions. There are fundamental institutions to society, and the stock market actually isn't one of them. There's fundamental institutions in society, and the state isn't even the most fundamental institution in society. God started the Bible with a marriage, and he actually ends, by the way, the Bible with a marriage. And so we talked about this with our friend on the Breakpoint podcast. Christopher West talks about all of this. And the fact that it's central to the biblical story, if you understand what the Bible is, means it's central to the human story. This isn't going to be a small thing. But then we can also go on to the opioid epidemic, right? Again, just like we've been talking about the decline in marriage, and especially the aging of adolescence and extended singleness. And by the way, the other key point here is that while the marriage rate has been going down, the cohabitation rate has been skyrocketing. And I think if you ask me what the story of American culture is for the last 3 generations, it's our attempt to substitute things out for marriage or to redefine marriage. Like, that's the whole story. That there's so many cultural factors, not just same-sex marriage, but cohabitation as a replacement, as just as good as anything else, sort of thing.
Cohabitation is, John, sort of concurrent with an alternate view of what it is to succeed and live the good life. And that's what a friend of mine on Facebook brought out when he posted this Wall Street Journal piece, and I thought it was fascinating. He said, we often talk in church about the idolization of marriage and family, and there's certainly a subculture where we do need to ask questions about how we're dealing with singles. But as a whole, our culture has come to value things that are almost they're almost incompatible with marriage, right? With young marriage, at least. They've come to value a trajectory of career, of success as a private individual that's very difficult to maintain while you're getting married, having children, starting a family early in life. And in that respect, the job of the church is going to be, if we hope to reverse this, decline in marriage, if we really do believe what you just said about marriage being a fundamental institution of society, more so even than Wall Street and the government, and dare I say it, career, then we need to be willing to buck against society there and start prioritizing things in the church that don't look like the priorities of the world. And that is going to be challenging.
Yeah, well, we talked about the perfect storm of causes and effects in this whole thing. And I'm going to make a swerve, and you're going to be like, what are you talking about? And that is Christian.
Go for it. Opioid crisis.
No. I'm actually going to preempt that. I'll get back to that in just a second. I'm saying we need to pray that Christian colleges find a solution for this. Here's why. Because the only place on the planet where this extended marriage and so on is brought down, the averages are brought down, where students are on average getting married in their mid-20s as opposed to basically almost 30, when the goal of life is not kind of put up high as being cohabitation, as like this is the good life, as you were talking about, is Christian colleges. And we have colleges and universities just scrambling right now to figure out what the fall is going to look like. And I've been talking about this with a number of Christian education. If Christian colleges can't be back on campus, that is one of the distinctives of Christian college life. Now, you might also add there might be a couple other, work at a Christian camp. Go work at Kanakuk if you want to get married. That's another good option too, or Summit Ministries or something like that. But this is going to be a real loss. And one of those is, it's not because it's the old joke that, well, you just go there to get your MRS degree or whatever. I'm not saying that at all.
Ring by spring, John.
Yeah, but there's a real thing here where there's a different set of values and a different set of priorities. Bring in another trend here, Shane, that we talked about this week, which is indications are New York City's not going to be the same after all of this. Now, people are going to say that's, if New York population starts to shrink, they're going to blame it on the coronavirus, but there's already been a decline in that city. Why? Well, because the people moving into that city are young professionals. They're living in kind of the, the millennial, amusement world of the nightlife of Manhattan and that sort of stuff. It's not conducive to a family. It's not conducive to long-term stability. It's not conducive really even to marriage, much more so to cohabitation or living together. And so we have these mega cities shrinking, and now you have these kind of mid-level cities have been growing to kind of meet. So you got New York kind of population kind of going down, and the Milwaukees and the Denvers and, and other things kind of growing. I say all that to say that's a demographic reality that the coronavirus also is accelerating. And we're going to see that, I think, in the days ahead too.
Well, that's along with the other losers in this demographic shift, and that's small towns. There's a University of New Hampshire study that found nearly 35% of rural counties and small towns in the U.S. are experiencing protracted and significant population loss, some of them up to 30% of their population in just the last couple of decades. So it seems like some of the big cities like New York are going to be suffering from this as a result of their cost of living just being astronomical, and people can't make it there.
Well, and if social distancing is a new reality, I mean,
it is.
You
it is going to be.
That's right. You could still social distance in Colorado Springs, right? You could still social distance in Jacksonville. You can still social distance, but even in Atlanta, because of the way Atlanta is built. But you can in Manhattan. Like, you could try, but you just literally can't do it. It's impossible. You have to violate physics in order to do that. There's just not a way to do it.
So what about the opioid crisis, John?
Well, we've been talking for months and weeks about the deaths from despair and loneliness. When we've just wrapped up our most recent short course here at the Colson Center, which is how Christians can run into brokenness, and we ended with how the church has been operating to deal with loneliness, suicide, desperation. Colorado Springs has been a central focus of that for the state of Colorado, which has been, one of the big states in the nation that has been living through this for a long time. Of course, with that goes opioids, addictions, and overdoses, and so on and so on and so on. And the church in Colorado Springs had figured out a way to really run into the brokenness here. It's really a remarkable story, and you were part of that short course this past Tuesday when David Galvan was talking about that. At the root of this is a problem with isolation and loneliness, and we just told everyone to go isolate and be lonely.
Right.
And at the root of this is that screens don't replace people, and we just send everybody to do that. So I think that's going to exacerbate the deaths from despair that we've seen. And of course, that's one of the reasons that many people have been pushing, like, we've got to come up with some solution to get people back to work somehow, because work brings that sense of satisfaction and meaning and purpose in a way that if you don't work, again, it's not one thing, it's a multitude of things, and work can actually be a way forward for many people.
Well, I'd like to also add, I know a lot of people are in financial trouble right now because of not being able to work, but because of the reduction in small towns and rural areas, because of this isolation and the fact that we've not been able to even go to church, and many people haven't even been able to attend remote services because their churches haven't set that up and don't have the ability to do it. Giving is way down. We just saw a report in the Washington Post that tithing is suffering substantially from this. And so small churches, many of which don't have any savings, are going to be on the rocks here. They're going to be having a really hard time keeping their doors open after this. So, the first step is to get back to church when the lockdown ends, and for all the reasons we've talked about for many episodes here on Breakpoint this week. But I'd say, as you can, if it's possible, continue giving to your church, because we believe as Christians that the church is not just the place where we come together to worship God, but also the hub of restoration in our community. And as we see an uptick in opioid deaths, we're going to want to have strong churches operating in precisely these communities. So that's the the real trouble. And there's a discouraging element to this too, but I think there's a challenge as well, John, and that's to help our churches to redouble our efforts to participate in these smaller bodies that are going to be able to reach out to their communities. And I don't want a world where just as great as some mega churches are, where only the mega churches have survived. I don't think that's a good outcome at all to this social isolation.
Well, in reality, that's, again, one of those trends that goes back before the coronavirus, and the coronavirus is serving as a catalyst to accelerate it. And these are important things to note, because if you misdiagnose the problem, you're going to misdiagnose the solution. If you think the problem is the coronavirus, then you're not going to think the solution involves kind of going back and figuring out what church is all about, either as a pastor, a leader, or as a congregant. And look, I think that behind this trend is problems probably in both areas, but primarily with congregants who see worship as something that they go in and watch, something that is to serve them, as opposed to participation, as opposed to an enabling of mission and all the other things that it's supposed to be. In other words, times like these, expose the problems, expose the chinks in the armor, so to speak. And I think we're going to see more and more of those things. I'm thankful, too, by the way, that I think there's some voices, particularly in the church, that are stepping up and leading. I'm thankful for the leadership in our church, Bishop Felix Orji. I'm thankful for Ed Stetzer and the work that he's done during this whole thing. And we'll continue to link to the great work that Ed and Rick Warren have been doing to help churches kind of lead through this coronavirus time. I think that's a very important service that they're providing for the church. And I also want to mention, too, that part of this, again, as Christians, is kind of getting our job right, that the church isn't, the place where the pastors work. The church is where Christians gather. And then we go out and live out our faith. And, we had anticipated having an in-person gathering this month in Washington, D.C. around the themes of why truth and love are not mutually exclusive options, why they have to be lived out together for people of faith, especially now at a time when truth is considered unloving and love is considered something that has nothing at all to do with truth, either the truth about ourselves or the truth about the world or the truth about morality. And so I'm grateful that God has led us and allowed us to still deliver a terrific event online. It's coming up in just a couple weeks. And if you come to breakpoint.org, we'll tell you how to find it. It's called the Truth Love Together virtual event. And it's an amazing lineup of folks who are going to just wrestle with what truth and love is. First of all, what is truth? That's module 1. Secondly, what is love? That's module 2. Module 3 is what does it mean to be people of truth and love? Module 4, how do we speak the truth in love? And module 5, how do we love the victims of lies with the truth? So we're trying to walk through the whole gamut of it, and just an amazing group of people, from Os Guinness to Joni Eareckson Tada, Lee Strobel, Andy Crouch, Lauren and Michael McAfee, Sean McDowell, Brett Kunkel, Uju Ekeocha, Katy Faust. The list goes on and on and on. And so, again, come to breakpoint.org and we'll tell you how to join that. And the other thing, Shane, we decided to do during this time is just basically not put any financial barriers between people and the content that we can offer. And so this online event is absolutely free.
Yeah, I think that's the coolest part about it, John, is we're going to be able to reach a lot of people that may not have been able to come to the Wilberforce weekend and potentially get that message out there in a way that it hasn't been before. So it's one of those examples of maybe turning social isolation on its head and making lemonade out of lemons.
Did you just go there? Did you just say lemonade out of lemons?
I did.
Oh, man. Have we heard
the first metaphor? It was the first metaphor that came to mind.
Never heard that one
if it's
before.
a little too boomer.
That was new for me.
Yeah. You've never heard that?
I'm teasing.
All right.
I think I've heard it 3 times this morning.
Wow. Okay. About the Wilberforce weekend?
No, just the phrase. Usually it's a celebrity right before they start singing the song Imagine.
Ooh. You went there.
I did.
Well, I think it's about time to wrap up here. Folks, come to breakpoint.org to find links to all the stories and articles that John and I have talked about today on the program. And also you can find there how to register for the Truth Love Together conference. Actually, the best place to go for that is going to be wilberforceweekend.org. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.